Hi there, and a very warm welcome to this week's video, in which we are tackling a sort of similar problem than last week, motion blur. I get a lot of questions about automotive motion blur, so when you move your car, there can be a bit of a tricky situation getting the motion blur right, and this is exactly what I want to tackle in this video. So without further ado, let's grab your coffee and let's jump right in. Welcome to the tutorial section. So this is what we are going to do today. At least essentially, basically this tutorial is about setting up the motion blur for everything, so you get the right amount of motion blur for the tires and the car, with the camera attached to the car without blurring up everything. This is essentially very easy to do, but as I say later in the tutorial, the devil's in the detail, so we are going over some cases that you might encounter, so you know what to do if you do so. Speaking about the animation, if you want to have a look at this exact scene, you can download that on my Patreon. The link is down in the description below. But now, let's actually start with the tutorial. Welcome to Cinema 4D Land, and as you can see the rig, small disclaimer here, we are not going into rigging today. As this should be a video about motion blur, I assume you already have a rig. Besides that, I'm not a rigging artist, and therefore I guess that other people can do much better than I did, as we will see in just a while, performance-wise at least. So let's have a look what state we are in here. What I have here is the rig, and if I press play, you can see it's moving, but as I said, it's not very performant, so it's moving slowly. If I go back to frame 0, what I also have is a car. And basically what I did is I linked the parts of the car with a constraint tag to my rig. And of course, if I now turn off my rig and then press play again, you can see it looks like as if the car is moving on its own, with the suspension going and so on. Oh, by the way, I also added the camera to the rig, so it moves with the car, because this was also something that a lot of people couldn't get going with their motion blur. Now, you probably already know that simulations such as this are best baked into keyframes for all situations, not only for motion blur, but for the fun of it, let's have a look what happens if you don't. To get started, let's switch our interface to Octane, and then make sure everything is set up for motion blur. This means all the moving parts have to be a child of one Octane object tag set to motion blur, and this one should be set to transform. Then let's find our camera and give it a Octane camera tag, so extensions Octane camera, under motion blur, turn it on and set it to angle. At least that's my favorite, as it gives you, dependent on your frame rate, a very common 180-degree shutter. As everything should be set up now, let's hit render and see what Octane makes of it. Once we have our image here, let's hit play one more time, and we are already in the movement, and you can see it's completely the opposite that we are after. The car is blurred, whereas the floor is not. So we need to bake actually. So how do we actually bake? It's very easy, barely an inconvenience. Let's go back to our frame 0 here. So we go to Window and then open the timeline, also called Dope Sheet. What we need to do now is drag in everything that is the car, basically the null here that is called car in my case. Then, with this selected, go to Functions and then Baking Options. Speaking of, let's have a look at the options at hand. For example, bake expressions is necessary, since those constraints are expressions and without them nothing would move. Grade copy, if we had animated stuff in here and didn't want to override those with the new baked keyframes, then grade copy would be a good thing, since otherwise you would lose your initial animation. Now, since we didn't have any animation in here, we can just use our original object. Now, clean tracks is a good one that I will actually apply, as it will clean off the animations of non-moving parts, or in this case parts that are just dragged along with the main animation of the car, such as the chassis here for example, as it doesn't have any movement on its own. Now the next part here is very self-explanatory. It will keep keyframes on the ticked items, so what we need is position, rotation, and no, we don't need animated parameters, so I untick it and click OK. And congratulations, you made your first bake. There seems to be something going on with the motion blur right now, but let's actually have a look whether it works the way we expect it to. Spoiler, we have to do one more thing in order to be able to scrub through the animation as we would expect, and this is to disable the constraints. There's a neat thing we can do, so if we flap this one here open, go to Tags, double-click on Constraints, this will select all the constraints so we can disable them altogether. And now if we scrub, we can finally see that the car is moving as expected. Very nice. So let's actually try if our rendering is now working correctly. So unpause it, and frame 80 is actually a good frame since we are already up to speed. So if we now press play, you can see, yes, the tire motion blur looks correct and the chassis is not blurring as before. And we have our motion blur on the floor actually as intended. Seems easy enough, right? So why do I even make this video? As they say, the devil's in the details, and a lot of people are getting those details wrong. I know this because over half of the questions I get on this topic are, how can I make my car look sharp when the camera is moving with it? So, whereas in reality, motion blur is a global thing applied to everything that's moving, no matter if camera or object, obviously due to settings in most renderers, people think of object motion blur and camera motion blur as a different thing. So if people want to have their car pristine and sharp, what they tend to do is just turn off the motion blur of the camera and not think about it globally, since they thought, well, the camera is within the car and the car is moving with the camera, so if I turn off the motion blur of the camera, then my car should be sharp, right? But let me show you what the renderer is actually seeing. Welcome to Explanation Land. Since everything motion blur happens between the frames, we need to do a small trick here. So let's go to our timeline yet again, then to Edit, and then turn off the frame snapping, so we can move through the frames fluently without snapping to singular frames. If I move my playhead through here and ignore the front wheel for now, you can see the interpolation Cinema 4D is capable of between keyframes. And this is the data Octane's motion blur is able to sample. So to recap, since both the motion blur of the object, the car, and the camera is enabled, they both move in parallel, so the motion blur actually is on the floor and of course the wheels. Now let me actually show you what it looks like for the renderer if we turn off the camera's motion blur. If we scrub through the subframe here, it only looks as if the car was moving unless we jump to a new frame, then the camera's position is updated. While this looks like nothing has changed if we scrub through our frames normally, only the subframes reveal that the camera is actually standing still. And therefore what's actually happening is the car is whizzing by a standing camera every frame. Long story short, don't turn off the motion blur of your camera to get a holistic approach to motion blur. Now, spoiler yet again, you can see that the wheels are doing strange things every now and then, and this is what we're up to next. Welcome back to our original scene. Let's investigate the strange rotations of our wheels. So let's click on one, go to the coordinates, the rotation coordinates, right-click, animation, and then show F-curve. Now, since our wheel is constantly rotating throughout the animation, what should happen is that the rotation P should increase over its whole lifespan. But if we look at the rotation P, that's not the case. If you're looking at those values, you can see that we are never getting above 180 degrees or below minus 180 degrees. So somewhere in the baking process, Cinema 4D is trying to playing it safe. In other words, when the tire is rotating above 180 degrees, Cinema 4D is resetting it to minus 180 degrees, therefore repeating its movement all over again. This is not visible while we move from frame to frame. It's clearly visible for the motion blur when it moves from a positive to a negative angle. So we actually need to refine our baking process to get the right numbers in here. Of course, I already know the culprit for this, and this is the constraint expression here. So if we search for tire, we can see that next to those expressions, I have an espresso tag that I used for the same functionality, because this output here is basically useless. And if you're not well versed in Espresso, it's as easy as dragging in your source tire, so the simulated one. Also, of course, the target object, our modeled tire, just drag this in like this, and then connect both of them with a global matrix. Let's actually go back to the start and bake everything again. Before we do that, I want to delete those constraints, then double click on the rest of the constraints and enable them again, and also search for the Espresso tags and do the same here. So since this is coming from all one simulation, it's best to not just bake those tires individually, but bake everything together. Let's do this again. Let's go to the timeline, then drag in the car like in the beginning, select it, then go to functions and then bake objects. And I think we are good to go. Now, like the first time we ran through this, what we need to do is disable the expressions such as the constraints, then scrub through here to see whether our animation worked. And yes, it seems like it. Let's actually go to our back wheel again, go to the animation and bring it up. And then let's see, yes, this looks much better now. One continuous increasing value. Very nice. Out of experience, baking is never a completely clean process. While we have the angle that we want here, we can go to our H and B axis and then increase them by hitting H. And you can see there are some values that look a little bit suspicious. So to see whether those are legit or not, you already know what to do. What we can do here is zoom in, then go and bring the playhead to this position. We don't need the rendering for this. What we need is go to edit and disable the frame snapping, then move over here and see what the reel is actually doing. So to be honest, in most cases, the axis value here should be leaning towards 0. So if we have like a very big dent in here, let's see. It's actually not too bad, but it wobbles a bit. The easy fix here would be to just delete those both axes. And of course, populate that then with a value of 0. Here we go. And if we do that for all the wheels, you can make sure that no weird wobbling is going on. Though, small disclaimer again, if you have stuff like a steering or something like that, you have to have an axis where the wheel sits in and basically only has to have this one value in order to rotate. Also, by the way, if you asked yourself why I didn't just bake the simulation here, basically you don't get visible keyframes from that and therefore you cannot debug your animations that well. So I would have never known that the constraint actually was responsible for the weird tire movement and the wobbling. Okay, last point before the bonus, something I kept hidden from you until now. If I turn on our rig here and then press play, you can see the rig is one frame advanced, or in other words, our constraint is lagging one frame behind. This has to do with priorities and with simulations and can be fixed within the constraints priorities. So if I double click that under basic, you can see here is a priority setting. So basically the way it goes, the lower in the list, the lower the priority, the higher up the list, the higher the priority, and in each group of those we also have numbers to actually fine-tune the priority, so the higher the number here, also the higher the priority. Since you want to see whether it works and not rely on our baked animation, let's enable those expressions again, and also don't forget to do the same thing with the Espresso. Let's go with the highest number and highest priority, then hit play, and yes, you can see no more lag. Very nice. And one more small disclaimer, if you are using the highest available priority, you need to make sure that this value is only used in your animation's output and not in other setups, because those other setups then can't have a higher priority and therefore will lag behind. To get around this, you would need to bring the priority at least down 1 point, so the next setup in line can actually have a higher priority. I hope this makes sense. And welcome to the bonus realm. Actually, it's the second most asked question that I get in terms of automotive and motion blur, but it's very easy to answer, so this is a bonus. We have our car model here and we have an animation on the wheels. If I play, you can see those are going really fast. So if I go somewhere in the middle where they are the fastest, then go and turn on our rendering and go one frame to the front, you can see what's happening here is we get really tiny wheels. So if you have a car that's driving on a road and driving really fast, at some point it looks like it's hovering above the ground, and obviously that's not what you want. So the way to do this is to give the renderer more geometry movement information. What we need to do is go to the render settings and then move to the time samplings per frame. What's really important to know is that this doesn't work in the live viewer. The live viewer always ever has one time sample per frame. So what I did is to render out some animations. Let's have a look what one time sample per frame looks like. And yes, it looks quite funny how the wheels are shrinking down when they get faster and then grow up again when they get slower. With the addition of one time sample only, we get a vastly improved effect, and the shrinkage isn't nearly as visible as before. Now, if you want to get up close, then 4 time samples reduce the effect to almost nothing, and you get a really round, blurred wheel as expected in reality. Of course, this is dependent on the speed of the rotation, so if your tire rotates faster, you need more samples again. And oh my god, what is this? An unexpected chart time? Basically, I want to dive more into the time samples so you really understand them. Let's say during the time the camera shutter is open, the wheel makes a quarter of a turn, so 90 degrees. And we are following one point representative of all the other points on the reel. So with one time sample, the only thing this point knows is its start and its end position. So if we move along, instead of moving on a circular basis here around the middle of the object, it moves straight down to its end position where it knows it will land. In other words, this point that is located here will be blurred towards this edge, and therefore cutting off a lot of the original shape of the object. And so are all the other points on the circumference. Adding time samples gives the motion blur in between stops, so it checks up on the actual position of the point, therefore minimizing the error of the straight movement. So if we, for example, add 4 time steps, here we go, then the error is really minimal and not too deviant from the original point. And of course, if the wheel moves faster, so a 360-degree rotation within the open shutter time, then those points will be spread around the whole wheel, so we would actually need more points to get to the same low error rate like this. I hope this was understandable, so this is chart time over. And this is also it for this week. I hope you liked it again and learned something. I have the feeling it was a tad bit convoluted, so if you still have questions, ask me in the comments. Worst case, I have to do another tutorial answering those questions. And now, as always, without further ado, let's thank those people who made this video possible, my patrons. Especially my €50 tier subscribers, Chiels Augustinen and Leon Studio TV. Also, of course, a huge thank you for my €15 tier subscribers, Doi Yim, For Die Thieves, Adam Sen, Alessio De Vecchi, Ami Schiedried, BVR, Christian Grajewski, Gabriel Machado, Graham Bucknell, Gregoris Morikis, Joel Muckemer, John Edward, Chris Clemson, Mahmoud Morsi, Ness Graphics, Nico Straub, Part 1 of 2, Ralf, Reiko, Shamus Johnson, Shiro 2049, Zoo Shag, Terry Wayne Ranson, Jan Verbeeke, and Yassin Rupp. Hello and welcome back to the backstage part of our video. So I thought, again, this might be a 5-minute video. It's really easy to explain and really easy to understand what can go wrong. And here we are, we have a 20-minute video again. If you still have some open questions about motion blur or anything else, let me know in the comments down below. Maybe this is a chance to get a video tutorial about this. Since this, as I mentioned, took longer than expected, maybe you can help me fight the algorithm overlords and post a racing car or a racing flag in the comments down below. Maybe a beach buggy emoticon, that would be nice, but I don't know if that even exists. Anyway, thank you very much for listening this long and staying till the very end. Have a great time ahead, and I say happy speeding. Stay lawful though. Bye.